When an avoidant chooses no contact, most people jump straight into self-blame. They assume the silence means rejection, that the pause means the story is over, that distance means they somehow failed. But that's not what's actually happening inside the avoidant. What's happening is far more complex and honestly, a lot more human. Avoidants don't pull away because they don't feel anything. They pull away because they feel too much and don't know what to do with it. Imagine growing up in an environment where emotions were unpredictable, where vulnerability was unsafe, where closeness meant pressure, judgment, or disappointment. When that's your emotional blueprint, connection becomes a trigger, something that lights up all those old patterns, all those unhealed places. So instead of dealing with that internal storm, the avoidant tries to shut it down. And no contact becomes the quickest, cleanest, most familiar way to do exactly that. It's not a strategy they sit down and plan. It's an instinct. It's a reflex. It's their way of regulating emotions that feel unmanageable. When they feel overwhelmed, they don't reach out for comfort the way a secure person might. They hit the brakes hard. They disconnect to avoid the intensity inside themselves. For them, silence feels safer than engaging. Pulling away feels easier than staying present. And if no one ever taught them how to sit with discomfort, how to communicate fear, how to express uncertainty, then disappearing becomes the only skill they have. This isn't about justifying the behavior. It's about understanding the psychology behind it so you stop interpreting their withdrawal as a reflection of your worth. You have to remember that avoidants spend most of their lives trying to control their inner world. They construct entire identities around being self-sufficient, emotionally independent, unbothered. But that image is fragile. The moment the connection grows deeper, the moment intimacy becomes real, that internal system starts to panic. They worry they'll lose themselves. They worry they'll lose control. They worry that closeness will expose wounds they've avoided for years. So no contact becomes a way to reset their sense of stability. They step back, not because you're too much, but because their own emotions are too much for them. The irony is that the more they care, the more overwhelmed they become. This is the part most people never understand. Connection intensifies the emotional load, and instead of leaning in, they retreat. It's the emotional equivalent of slamming the door before a storm hits. And for a moment, they feel relief. Silence gives them room to breathe, or at least that's what they believe. But underneath that stillness, there's turbulence. Even if they don't show it, even if they seem detached, the decision weighs on them. Avoidants aren't indifferent. They're afraid of the intensity inside them. They're afraid of the parts of themselves that get exposed in relationships. They're afraid of repeating past failures, past shames, past emotional collapses. Withdrawal feels like the only way to stop the cycle. But here's the deeper philosophical truth. No one escapes themselves. You can run from another person, but you can't outrun your own mind. So even as the avoidant withdraws, they're still battling the very emotions they tried to shut down. And in that silence, the emotional pressure doesn't disappear. It grows. It expands in the empty space. Without the distraction of the relationship, without the comfort of your presence, without the rhythm of connection, they're left with the very things they were trying to avoid. Their fears, their insecurities, their guilt, their longing. All of it returns louder than before because now there's no one else to blame and nowhere else to hide. This is why no contact isn't just about absence. It's about confrontation. It forces the avoidant into a psychological corner. They're alone with their own reactions, their own doubts, their own unresolved past. And the longer they sit in that space, the more they realize the exit they thought would bring peace is actually forcing them inward. It's pushing them to face the discomfort they've been postponing for years. And maybe for the first time, they start recognizing that the silence isn't neutral. It's not a relief. It's not freedom. It's a magnifier. That's why you cannot take their withdrawal personally. Their choice is not a verdict on your value. It's a reflection of their internal battle. You didn't cause that battle, and you can't fix it. But you also don't have to crumble beneath the weight of their silence. Your strength lies in understanding the truth. Their no contact is not about you. It's their attempt to regulate emotions they were never taught to hold. And when you realize that, something shifts. You stop chasing. You stop panicking. You stop shrinking. You stand still, grounded, knowing that someone else's fear is not a measure of your worth. The moment you understand that, their silence loses its power over you. When an avoidant chooses distance, they often believe they're creating safety. In their mind, stepping back is the fastest way to quiet the emotional noise that relationships naturally stir up. They grew up learning sometimes painfully, that closeness can lead to disappointment or pressure. So they internalize this idea that space equals protection. But what they don't realize is that the space they're creating isn't actually protecting them from the outside world. It's protecting them from the inside world they're terrified to confront. That's the part most people misunderstand. They think the avoidant is running from you, but really the avoidant is running from the intensity inside themselves. Imagine living your life with a belief system that says opening up is dangerous, needing someone is weakness, attachment leads to loss. When that's the script playing in the background of your mind, distance feels like the only reasonable response to emotional tension. It feels safe, predictable, manageable. But just because something feels safe doesn't mean it's healthy, and it definitely doesn't mean it's sustainable. Avoidants choose space believing it will create clarity, but what it actually creates is emotional distortion. Because once they step back, once the silence grows, once the gap widens, the things they thought they were escaping don't fade, they intensify. The human mind is wired for connection. Even avoidants, despite what their behavior might suggest, are deeply affected by attachment. They're not immune to missing someone. They're not disconnected from emotion. They're disconnected from the expression of emotion. So when they use distance as their safety net, it only works for a short while. In the beginning, the quiet feels calming. They get a momentary sense of control. But very quickly, the silence becomes a magnifying glass. It enlarges the thoughts they've been trying to suppress. It amplifies the guilt they're trying to ignore. It highlights the contradictions between what they want and what they fear. And here's where the deeper psychological paradox kicks in. The more they try to avoid vulnerability, the more vulnerable they become to their own internal world. That's the irony. Distance doesn't insulate them. It exposes them. It reveals the emotional patterns they've spent years hiding under routine, independence, distraction, or avoidance. When they're standing alone in the quiet, without you to blame for their discomfort, without the relationship to blame for their triggers, they start to notice something they didn't expect. The thing they thought was protecting them is actually isolating them. And that isolation doesn't feel like safety anymore. It feels like loss. Avoidants have a tendency to intellectualize their emotions. They rationalize their withdrawal. They create narratives that justify the space. I just need time. I can't handle conflict. It's better if I pull away before things get worse. And on the surface, these reasons seem logical. But logic is not the problem. Emotional suppression is. They're not actually solving anything by withdrawing. They're postponing the inevitable discomfort that comes with connection, but they're also postponing the growth that comes with it. No relationship, no matter how healthy, can evolve without emotional risk. But for an avoidant, emotional risk feels like stepping off a cliff with no guarantee that anyone will catch them. So, they choose what feels familiar. Distance, silence, space. But familiarity is not the same as fulfillment, and this is where the philosophical truth begins to emerge. Safety built on avoidance is not safety, it's limitation. It's a cage disguised as control. And once they're in that cage, the absence of emotional chaos doesn't bring peace. It brings confinement. It brings a sense of emptiness they can't explain. It brings the realization that distance didn't simplify anything, it complicated everything. Because in that space, they start to feel the contrast. They feel the weight of your presence missing. They notice the absence of connection. They sense the emotional vacuum that silence creates. And slowly, almost reluctantly, they begin to understand that the space they thought was protecting them is actually costing them something meaningful, something irreplaceable. You can't force an avoidant to see this. They have to collide with the truth on their own terms. But your job is not to break down their walls. Your job is to stop internalizing their distance as a personal deficiency. You cannot rescue someone from patterns they're still defending, and you cannot shrink yourself to make their fear more comfortable. When they choose space, you choose self-respect. When they withdraw, you stay centered. When they retreat, you remain grounded in your own emotional clarity. Because here's the bottom line. Distance may feel like protection in the moment, but real safety comes from courage, not avoidance. And sooner or later, the avoidant will realize that the cost of distance is far greater than the discomfort of connection. That's the moment their illusion breaks. When an avoidant pulls away, they're not just watching their own behavior, they're watching yours. They're silently observing how you respond to the space they create. And this is where most people lose their footing, because the instinct is to close the distance. You want to fix it, understand it, talk through it, or reestablish connection as quickly as possible. But from the avoidance perspective, that reaction only reinforces their fears. It confirms what they already believe about relationships, that closeness leads to pressure, that emotion leads to chaos, that intimacy leads to losing control. So when you chase, you unintentionally strengthen the very pattern that's pushing them away. But here's the part that more people need to understand. Your reaction to their silence isn't just a response. It's a message. It tells them who you are. It tells them what you expect from yourself. It tells them the level of emotional maturity you bring into the connection. And when you choose not to chase, not to panic, not to shrink yourself to keep them close, you disrupt the cycle they've relied on their entire lives. You introduce a new dynamic, one they never prepared for. Because avoidants are comfortable with distance, but they're not comfortable when their distance doesn't create the emotional reaction they anticipated. Think about it. They pull back because they expect you to step forward. That's the dance they know. They retreat and you advance. They disappear and you fill the gap. They withdraw and you soften, apologize, or adjust. That pattern makes them feel safe because it gives them all the control. They get the comfort of attachment without the responsibility of vulnerability. But the moment you stop playing that role, everything shifts. When you hold your ground, when you remain calm instead of reactive, when you allow the silence to exist without chasing closure, you interrupt their emotional rhythm. You show them a version of strength they don't know how to categorize. This isn't about playing games. It's about emotional self-respect. It's about refusing to lose yourself in someone else's avoidance. When you stay grounded, you send a clear signal. I'm not afraid of space. I'm not collapsing because you step back. I don't abandon myself just because someone else is uncomfortable. And that's the moment the avoidant starts to notice something they didn't expect. You're not like the others. You're not feeding the pattern. You're not reinforcing their belief that intimacy always turns into pressure. You're showing them that emotional stability is not a demand, but a standard. And that completely alters their perception of you. The deeper truth is that avoidants need to see that you're N.O.T. dependent on their validation to feel secure. That's what earns their respect. That's what builds attraction. That's what shifts the dynamic from fear to curiosity. When you maintain your center, you become someone they can't easily categorize, someone they can't dismiss as too much, someone they can't blame for their discomfort. Instead, they're forced to confront their own reactions. Your calmness becomes a mirror, reflecting back the instability they've been hiding from. Your stillness exposes their internal storm. Your emotional discipline reveals their emotional avoidance. And once they see that, they start questioning their assumptions. They begin to feel the contrast between your groundedness and their withdrawal. They notice that the silence they thought would give them control is suddenly highlighting their lack of it. That's when they start realizing that maybe their coping strategy isn't as effective as they believed. Maybe distance isn't the answer. Maybe the discomfort isn't coming from you. It's coming from their own unhealed patterns. This is why your response matters so much. You can't force an avoidant to open up. You can't push them into emotional maturity, but you can model what emotional clarity looks like. You can show them without trying to teach them what self-respect feels like. And the beauty of this approach is that it protects you too. Instead of pouring your energy into trying to save the connection, you're investing that energy into preserving your identity. Instead of bending yourself around their fear, you're grounding yourself in your own truth. That's powerful. That's magnetic. That's the kind of strength that stays with someone long after the silence ends. So when the avoidant pulls back, your job isn't to react. It's to remain clear, to remain centered, to remain grounded in who you are, not who they need you to be to feel safe. Because the moment you do that, the dynamic stops being about their fear and starts being about your power. And that's the moment everything changes. When the avoidant chooses no contact, they genuinely believe they're stepping into peace. They think the silence will calm the emotional pressure, reduce the expectations, reset their nervous system, and give them space to breathe. And in those first few moments, sometimes the first few days, it feels like that. There's a quick relief, a sense of escape, a temporary return to a world where they only have to manage themselves. But that relief is shallow. It doesn't last. Because what avoidants forget is that when they remove the relationship, they remove the distraction. And once the distraction is gone, they no longer have anything blocking the feelings they've been running from. This is where no contact becomes a psychological trap they unintentionally walk into. They expect silence to protect them, but silence actually confronts them. It exposes them. It corners them in their own emotional patterns. Without the relationship to blame, without the conflict to point to, without you to project their fear onto, they are left alone with the one thing they've worked their entire lives to avoid, their internal world. And that internal world doesn't go quiet just because they shut the door. It gets louder. Emotions they didn't want to feel start resurfacing. Thoughts they pushed down start rising back up. Memories, guilt, longing, confusion, they all grow in the empty space they thought would bring clarity. Avoidants often misunderstand their own emotional experience. They interpret discomfort as danger. They interpret vulnerability as pressure. They interpret closeness as a threat to independence. So when they create distance, they expect that emotional discomfort to disappear. But the truth is, distance doesn't erase emotion. It removes the external stimulus and leaves the emotion intact. That's the part they never expect, and it's the part that forces the deepest internal confrontation. And here's the fascinating thing. You're not even in the room, yet the emotional impact you left behind becomes stronger in your absence. They replay moments. They examine things you said. They question decisions they made, not because they're sentimental, but because the mind naturally tries to resolve unfinished emotional tension. Avoidants think distance will close the loop, but it actually opens it wider. They thought silence would simplify things. Instead, it complicates them. And with each passing day, the emotional weight they tried to escape doesn't fade. It concentrates. What really shakes an avoidant is realizing that their strategy isn't neutral. They believed pulling away would press pause, but nothing in the emotional world pauses. It keeps moving, evolving, expanding, even when they're trying to stop the motion. And they begin to feel the consequences of that. Not externally, internally. They start to sense the gap between what they feel and what they're used to expressing. They begin to see how much of their emotional life they've been outsourcing to avoidance. And when no contact forces them into solitude, that pattern becomes impossible to ignore. This is when genuine introspection begins. Not the kind that's deliberate, but the kind that's unavoidable. No contact leaves them no one to manage but themselves. No expectations to dodge, no conversations to escape, no emotional intensity to blame on someone else. They are alone with the truth they've been sidestepping for years, and the truth is simple. Avoidance is not freedom. It's a coping mechanism. It's a shield that became a cage. And in that cage, the absence of emotional demand doesn't feel like liberation. It feels isolation. There's also a philosophical shift that begins to happen inside them. Humans, even avoidants, are relational creatures. We're wired for connection, for meaning, for emotional resonance. So when they remove connection, they remove access to those things too. They didn't expect the cost to feel this heavy. They didn't expect the silence to feel so revealing. They didn't expect the quiet to expose the very wounds they were trying to hide. And suddenly, the emotional pressure they thought they escaped returns, not through you, but through their own awareness. And while they're wrestling with that internal conflict, something else becomes apparent. You didn't chase. You didn't panic. You didn't rush in to soothe or stabilize the situation. You didn't interrupt their process. That stillness on your end magnifies the contrast even further. It makes them realize the emotional chaos wasn't coming from you. It was coming from them. And that realization is powerful. It forces them to look inward instead of outward. So when an avoidant chooses no contact, it's not the escape they imagine. It's the beginning of the emotional confrontation they've been postponing. They don't get relief. They get revelation. They don't find peace. They find themselves face to face with the truth. When the avoidant steps back, it creates a moment of truth, not just for them, but for you. And this is where your emotional independence becomes the defining factor that shifts the entire dynamic. You don't have to plead, explain, negotiate, or prove anything. In fact, doing any of that only reinforces the very fear that drove them away. But when you choose to stand firmly in yourself, when you choose stability over reactivity, something powerful happens. You break the cycle. You interrupt the emotional script that both of you have been unconsciously acting out. Avoidants expect that stepping away will give them control. They assume their silence will create urgency in you. They believe the distance will make you doubt yourself, question your value, or chase them harder. That's the pattern they know, and for most of their lives it has worked. But your emotional independence dissolves that illusion instantly when you don't collapse into their absence, when you don't start rearranging yourself to win back their attention. You communicate a message far more powerful than words. I am not defined by your fear. People often underestimate how deeply avoidants study behavior. They're hyper-aware, even if they seem distant. They watch how much pressure they feel. They watch how much responsibility you expect them to carry. They watch how much of your emotional balance depends on them. So when you make the choice to stand strong, to live, grow, move forward, and maintain your inner stability without chasing the connection, you're showing them something rare. You're showing them that closeness doesn't have to come with emotional burden. You're showing them that you aren't controlled by their withdrawal. And you're showing them that you can regulate your emotions independently, which is something they've never truly learned how to do. Your emotional independence becomes a new reference point they didn't expect to encounter. It signals that the relationship's emotional weight is no longer pushing toward them. And ironically, that's when avoidants start to lean in. Not because you manipulated, but because you removed the pressure that triggered their fear in the first place. You created space, not the kind that abandons them, but the kind that respects both of your emotional boundaries. That kind of space feels safe to them in a way they don't even have language for. And when you stop trying to convince them of your worth, they begin to see it on their own. That's the part the avoidant never anticipates. They're used to people chasing, fixing, accommodating, but your stillness, your clarity, your grounded presence, it all stands in stark contrast to the chaos they experience inside themselves. They see you reclaiming your energy. They see you investing in your life instead of investing in their fear. They see you choosing growth instead of waiting in emotional limbo, and that difference becomes undeniable. There's also a deeper philosophical layer here. Emotional independence is, and about indifference. It's not about pretending you don't care. It's about caring without surrendering your center. It's about showing that connection is something you choose, not something you cling to. When you embody that kind of strength, it creates a natural gravity. It draws respect. It draws curiosity. It draws the avoidant out of their familiar patterns because suddenly you're not acting like someone who needs them to feel whole. You're acting like someone who sees yourself as whole already. And that changes everything. Avoidants don't know what to do with someone who doesn't collapse in their absence. It forces them to reevaluate. It makes them wonder why you aren't reacting the way they predicted. It challenges the fear-based beliefs they've been carrying. And as uncomfortable as that is for them, it's also transformative because your behavior becomes a mirror. It reflects the side of them that wants connection but doesn't know how to sustain it. It reflects the part of them that's tired of running. It reflects the truth that maybe, just maybe, they're afraid of something they no longer need to fear. And the beauty is your emotional independence doesn't just shift their perception. It protects your well-being. It keeps you from getting entangled in someone else's unresolved patterns. It keeps you from losing yourself to someone else's silence. It keeps you from confusing their fear with your responsibility. You're showing them a version of strength they've never experienced, strength that doesn't demand, strength that doesn't chase, strength that doesn't break under pressure. And that kind of strength stays with them long after the silence ends. When an avoidant goes no contact, there comes a moment, sometimes sooner, sometimes much later, where the silence stops feeling like protection and starts feeling like consequence. Not punishment, not retaliation, but the natural outcome of the emotional choices they've made. And this is the point where something interesting happens. They start to sense the shift in the dynamic, not because you've changed your behavior toward them, but because you've changed your behavior toward yourself. That difference is unmistakable. When they pull away and you don't collapse, when they create distance and you fill your own life instead of the gap they left, it alters the emotional landscape. They suddenly find themselves on the outside of something they expected to still have access to. What avoidants don't anticipate is how much their internal world depends on the emotional stability of the person they've pulled away from. They assume they can disconnect, and everything between you and them will simply stay the same. Paused, frozen, waiting for them to come back when they feel ready. They expect access without accountability. But when you step into your own power, when you start reclaiming your time, your energy, your emotional footing, the dynamic stops orbiting around their fear. And for the first time, they feel the impact of their avoidance in a tangible, undeniable way. This is where their self-protective strategy begins to backfire. No contact creates a psychological vacuum, and vacuums get filled, not by chasing them, not by pleading for answers, but by your growth, your progress, your resilience. They expected you to wait in stillness Instead, you moved, and that movement disrupts their comfort. It forces them to confront a truth they didn't anticipate. Distance didn't freeze the connection, it changed it, and it changed you. Avoidants often believe that emotional distance keeps things predictable, but nothing stays predictable when one person evolves. Your growth becomes a wake-up call they didn't see coming. They start noticing things they weren't paying attention to before. The confidence in your voice, the steadiness in your decisions, the absence of emotional dependency. And because avoidants are hypersensitive to shifts in emotional tone, they pick up on these changes quickly. They feel the energy difference even from a distance. They feel that you're not holding the door open out of fear or longing. You're standing on your own path, and that creates a different kind of gravity. This is also the point where the avoidant begins to sense the risk they didn't factor into their withdrawal, not the risk of losing you emotionally, that's something they've always underestimated, but the risk of losing access to the version of you that once made them feel safe, admired, grounded, or connected. Avoidants don't fear being alone. They fear losing the emotional stability of someone who made them feel understood. And when you rise in your own strength, that fear becomes real. Now, this isn't about triggering them or trying to manipulate their response. This is about understanding how human psychology works. When one person stops participating in an emotional dynamic, the entire dynamic shifts. The avoidant can feel that shift as a kind of emotional contrast, your clarity against their confusion, your growth against their stagnation, your groundedness against their internal chaos. And whether they admit it or not, it impacts them. This is usually the moment where avoidants start feeling a pull back toward the connection, not because they suddenly became emotionally secure, not because they had a magical breakthrough, but because your transformation makes them question their assumptions. They begin to wonder whether they misinterpreted your intentions, whether they projected their fears onto you, whether they withdrew from something that was actually safe. It's the first time they consider that maybe the danger wasn't the relationship, it was their avoidance. But here's the important part. That pull toward you doesn't mean you should shrink back into your old patterns. It doesn't mean you abandon your growth or soften your boundaries or compromise your emotional independence. Their pull is not the destination, it's the confirmation. It confirms that the strongest thing you can do in the face of their silence is stay committed to your own evolution. Because that evolution is what changes the relationship. Not the silence, not the waiting, not the hoping. Every step you take toward your own strength is a step away from the emotional pattern that kept you stuck. And whether the avoidant comes back or not, your growth remains, your clarity remains, your sense of self remains. And that's the part they notice most, the part that forces them to rethink everything they assumed about you, about themselves, and about what the connection meant. The truth is, when an avoidant chooses no contact, it feels like a disappearance, a sudden void, a silence that echoes louder than anything they ever said out loud. And for a long time, you probably thought that silence meant something about you, that you weren't enough, that you pushed too hard, that you got it wrong. But the more you understand what's really happening underneath their retreat, the more you realize that their silence is not a statement about your worth. It's a reflection of their internal battle. You've walked through every layer of this dynamic now. You've seen how their fear masquerades as control, how distance feels safer than connection, and how the absence they choose is less about rejecting you and more about protecting themselves. And once you see this clearly, something shifts. You stop romanticizing their avoidance. You stop trying to decode their emotional math. You stop minimizing your needs just to keep the peace. What you begin to understand is that your growth, your clarity, your boundaries, your self-respect, is the real breakthrough in this story. Because here's the part people often miss. No contact is not just their coping mechanism. It becomes your mirror. It forces you to ask questions you've probably avoided for years. What do I deserve? What do I want? Why am I accepting the crumbs of someone else's fear instead of the fullness of someone else's presence? And when you finally sit with those questions long enough, you realize you're not waiting for them anymore. You're waiting for you, your strength, your breakthrough, your moment where you stop negotiating with someone else's emotional limitations, and maybe, without realizing it, their silence becomes your turning point. Because when someone backs away from you long enough, you start moving toward yourself. You start building stability from the inside out instead of trying to squeeze it out of someone who struggles to offer it. And eventually, you hit this internal threshold where you stop chasing clarity from the very person who cannot give it. You create your own clarity. You choose your own direction. You step into the version of you that isn't defined by their coping style, but by your courage. Yes, they may feel your absence. Yes, they may return. Yes, they may wake up to what they lost. Avoidants often do once the safety of your presence is gone. But by the time that moment comes, something in you will already have evolved. You'll be standing in a place of emotional strength, inner calm, and self-awareness that makes you see everything differently. You won't be hoping they choose you. You'll be deciding whether you choose them. And that's the most powerful position you can ever be in. So as you walk away from this message today, take this with you. Their silence is not the ending of your story. It's the beginning of a deeper, more honest version of you. One that doesn't shrink to fit someone's fear. One that doesn't equate distance with destiny. One that refuses to settle for half love or half effort or half presence. You deserve someone who chooses you. Not when it's convenient, not when it's safe, not when they're lonely, but consistently, intentionally, and with the kind of emotional availability that feels like home, not like a battlefield. Their no contact may have triggered your pain, but your response can ignite your transformation. Let this be the moment you stop waiting for someone who runs and start walking toward the life, the love, and the peace you were meant for. Because the real power isn't in being chosen, it's in choosing yourself.